Imagine this. It's 1620. The snow is swirling outside like flour in a bakery, run by a very enthusiastic ghost, and you're inside your wooden home. Not a log cabin, mind you, but an actual box of wood that creaks with every sigh of the wind. It's winter, and insulation as you know it is just a glimmer in a future engineer's eye. And yet, you're not frozen solid. How? Welcome, sleepy friend, to one of history's coziest paradoxes. Let's time travel to a past where double-glazed windows were just windows, possibly made from oiled paper if you were lucky, and possibly missing altogether if you were not. People lived in drafty homes, many open to the elements in creative ways, ranging from poorly thatched roofs to generous gaps between wall planks that acted as unrequested ventilation shafts. Picture a house that breathes heavily, like a dog with a cold. So how did they survive? The secret lay in accepting the cold like a stubborn roommate. You didn't try to banish it, you simply outstubborned it. Architects and peasants alike built homes with one clear design principle: keep heat where the humans are. Often, that meant everyone, and I do mean everyone, clustering into one room lined with whatever warmth-generating elements were available. That could be a fireplace, seldom extinguished from October to March, or a rather large family pig that slept indoors. No, your ears aren't deceiving you. There are reports, especially from rural parts of Europe, of humans sharing a room, and sometimes even bedding arrangements, with livestock. The pig stayed because it was warm. You stayed because the pig stayed, and everyone politely agreed not to talk about it. Heat, once made, was precious, a treasure you held onto like your last good pair of wool socks. Early homes often had thick, low ceilings designed to trap heat. Beamed ceilings weren't just an aesthetic from BBC period dramas. They were highways for hanging smoked meats and a clever way to keep warm air within reach. Sleeping quarters were commonly set above the main living space, since heat rises. A lesson most 8-year-olds learned by jumping over a fire in the hearth and immediately deciding never to repeat the experiment. Clothing, too, did a lot of heavy lifting. Folks wore layers upon layers, often sleeping in their garments, not out of laziness, but out of deep, unshakable wisdom. Wool undergarments, wool stockings, wool caps. If you were lucky enough to own one pair of warm boots, you likely wore them to bed, not for any fashion purpose, just for the sheer satisfaction of being marginally less frostbitten than your neighbor. Blankets were rarely just blankets. They were great beasts of textiles, densely woven, sometimes filled with straw or wool, and often shared communally. Whole families, even extended ones, might sleep together under one great mammoth of a coverlet. This created a kind of human lasagna, with layers and layers of slowly warming flesh. Romance was rare, but survival, steamy. And let's not forget the nocturnal routines. In many homes, fires were banked at night, that is, covered with ashes to keep embers smouldering until morning. Rekindling a fire from embers was much easier than starting from scratch. Matches hadn't yet been invented, so lighting fires involved flint, steel, and precisely 487 tiny irritated curses. If the fire died overnight, someone, usually the most responsible or most gullible, was sent to the neighbor's house carrying embers in a metal pot. It was like borrowing sugar, except much more critical to not spill. Now perhaps you're wondering, what about insulation made from things like hay or moss or horsehair? While yes, in some homes these were stuffed between wall beams or under floorboards, they were less insulation and more hopeful stuffing. Air leaks were inevitable. Moss helps until it gets soggy. and then it's just a damp hug from nature. But still, people endured. Not because they loved the cold, heaven no, but because they got creative with limited tools and a great deal of community warmth. Winter was not merely a season, it was a group effort. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, snuggle in. Soon, we'll look more closely into the fire that kept these ancient homes beating like warm little hearts in a sea of frost. For now, let the wind rattle your imaginary wooden shutters and dream of a warm hearth. And possibly a large pig. Before humans discovered fiberglass, polystyrene, or the inexplicably satisfying term spray foam, they survived winters armed with thick socks, fiery determination, and an unshakable belief that frostbite was just a strong personality trait. But how cold were homes in, say, the year 1347? Let's just say, if your breath didn't frost inside your own bedroom, you were either royalty or unintentionally on fire. The humble medieval home, often called a hall house, wasn't so much a form of shelter as it was an elaborate excuse to own a roof. Stone walls, open hearths, and a delightful draught that carried the gossip from the barn straight to the chamber pot meant interior temperatures could merely flirt with freezing instead of fully embracing it. Now, for those who could afford it, meaning anyone with more than 2 chickens and a good sword, houses had thick walls made of wattle and daub. This ancient method, used from the Neolithic period well into the 19th century in some lucky corners of Europe, involved weaving wooden sticks, the wattle, together, and slapping on a muddy mixture of straw, clay, and animal dung, the daub. Did it insulate? Technically. Imagine living inside a giant mud pie that also smelled a bit agricultural. But the magic wasn't just in the walls. The primary weapon against the cold was the ever-loyal open hearth, usually located smack dab in the middle of the main room. Picture a fire pit, gently wafting smoke upward, freely, into the living space. Chimneys hadn't been invented yet, so the smoke had to make its awkward way through thatch roofing and your lungs. A roaring fire would warm the room, eventually. First, it would heat up the rafters, cook 6 spiders, and cure a side of ham hanging in the beams like some kind of porky chandelier. Clothing inside the home took on a militaristic logic. You layered up like an onion with social anxiety. Wool cloaks, linen shirts, undertunics, overtunics, and mittens that resembled tiny sheep. At night, people didn't so much undress for bed as strategically collapse in full outfit under a herd's worth of blankets, some made of sheepskins, others from coarse wool, so itchy you had dreams of becoming a cactus. Sharing beds wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was a survival tactic. Whole families snuggled together in a pile that can best be described as affectionate sardines. In inns and homelessness, shelters known as almshouses, strangers shared mattresses too, though the term mattress might be generous. Often it was a lumpy sack of straw that creaked, crunched, and occasionally leaked wildlife. Interestingly, windows, those traitorous holes in the wall, played an elite role in letting the heat out. Most didn't have glass. That luxury was for monasteries, palaces, and churches. Regular folks used wooden shutters or thin animal horns sliced and oiled to translucently muffle the breeze. Want to let light in? Congrats, it's now 7 degrees colder. Want to keep heat in? Enjoy total darkness and the company of bats. And just when you thought it couldn't get cozier, enter the thatched roof. Charming, yes, insulating, Not particularly. Rodents adored it. Snow slipped between the reeds, and spark-happy fires could turn a small village into toast in 8 minutes flat. But hey, there's nothing like knowing your ceiling might set itself ablaze to make you appreciate thermal risks. Still, our ancestors were resourceful. They developed the cunning practice of sleeping boxes, actual wooden compartments built around beds. Picture a wardrobe married a bunk bed and decided comfort was optional. These enclosed boxes trapped body heat better than an open bed, making them the medieval equivalent of a snuggy TM you could live in. Even farm animals got involved. In colder regions like Scandinavia, it wasn't unusual to keep cows and goats inside during winter, not in a charming pastoral sense, but because they radiated warmth. A cow, after all, is just a very round radiator with hooves. The downstairs of a 2-story farmhouse might house the beasts, while the humans slept upstairs, warmed by both familial love and a subtle bouquet of methane. And so, they made it through, wrapped in layers, huddled in sleeping. Boxes, dappled with soot like cozy chimney sweeps. Comfort was relative, and expectations were low. But if you didn't freeze to death, the house did its job. And if it snowed indoors, well, that was just God's way of decorating. Eventually, though, things would begin to shift. Roofs would get smarter. Fires would find chimneys. And glass, wondrous, shimmery glass, would start sneaking its way into windows. But before that happened, there was one more ancient architectural solution to winter's wrath, used for centuries across empires, from chilly Brittany to the windswept Mongolian steppe. Now, picture the average winter evening in a 16th century European cottage. Outside, the wind is orchestrating a full-throated opera through the bare hedgerows. The moon is just a rumour behind snow-thick clouds, and the chickens have tucked themselves in with more efficiency than your last group chat of friends trying to pick a dinner spot. Inside the cottage, though, now there's the interesting bit. You might imagine a roaring fire, hearty mugs of mulled cider, and thick, wall-ready blankets. But hold that thought. Let's begin first with the walls. The actual walls. They weren't insulated, of course, at least not in the sense we understand today. Many were made of wattle and daub, an ancient, humble blend of woven branches smeared with a noble paste of mud, chopped straw, and animal dung. Yes, actual dung, because in those days, if it could stick to a wall and block wind, it was considered divine architecture. These walls were breathable, as the historians say. That's polite historian speak for. They let in every breeze, draft, and ghost with an invitation to tea. And yet, people didn't freeze. Not entirely anyway. Inside, the hearth wasn't just a cozy fireplace. It was the heart of the home. A place of fire and food and, arguably, indoor smoke that did wonders for the sinuses in small to medium miserable doses. It was lit nearly all the time during winter, often squatting in the middle of the single room that served as kitchen, dining area, sewing salon, and, somewhat alarmingly, bedroom. Families were not only encouraged to gather close for warmth, they were essentially forced into it by architectural design. The more the merrier, or at least the warmer. Now, beds, or should we say, the bed, because there often was just one, usually belonging to, or rather dominated by, the parents, whose children would climb in beside them at night. This wasn't improper. This was thermodynamic survival. These cozy cuddle puddles became something of a necessity, as multiple warm bodies strategically nested together worked better than most firewood. Sometimes, grandparents, cousins, and any passing neighbour with a story and a bottle of something vaguely medicinal might fold themselves in too. Privacy was left at the door, somewhere between the goats and the woodpile. Speaking of goats, don't be surprised if they were invited inside, not merely for company, although few can resist the warm nose of a barnyard ruminant. No, animals gave off body heat, about the equivalent of a small electric heater, if you're wondering. In alpine regions, people designed their homes so the livestock slept underneath the living quarters, allowing heat to drift upwards. Welcome to central barn floor heating, brought to you by Bessie the cow. But human ingenuity didn't stop at sleeping arrangements or bovine roommates. People wore their insulation. Layers of woolens, linen shifts, cloaks, socks knitted by candlelight. And yes, the iconic nightcap, which was less fashion statement, more frostbite prevention tool. Hair and heat both rise, and that little bit of cloth meant the difference between sweet dreams and Arctic scalp syndrome. Even beds had their own tricks. Think hot stones wrapped in cloth and slipped among the sheets. Or bed warmers, little metal pans filled with embers or coals, swiftly run between the linens before nesting in. Just don't linger too long. Smouldering embers tend not to care about thread counts. At the chillier fringes of society, places like Scandinavia and Russia, beds became fully armoured. Box beds with doors, basically built-in cupboards for your entire sleeping self. Close the hatch, snuggle inside, and you're a cinnamon roll in a wooden drawer. Or picture the Polish piece, a masonry stove the size of a small SUV, gently radiating heat, providing, if you're lucky, a built-in platform to doze atop. Heating and lounging in one glorious toasty slab. Humans did whatever it took, and often with a kind of medieval cheerfulness. One 17th century Englishman wrote of waking in the morning to find his chamber pot frozen. He merely shrugged and complimented the fine honesty of the northern wind. That's the spirit. Yes, winter was biting, bitter, and often inconveniently located immediately after autumn. But it wasn't insurmountable. People worked with what they had, be it fire, fur, or familial pylons, and found comfort in community, closeness, and a good layer of sheep-based textiles. And what about the truly extravagant homes? The mansions, castles, and stately manors? Surely their stone walls offered decadent warmth and coziness. Ah, well, that's a story we'll slowly crack into next, one stone-cold chamber at a time. As the wind howled through the bare trees of northern Europe, our pre-insulation ancestors had already mastered a perfectly respectable method of saying, "No thank you, I will not turn into a human icicle tonight." The secret? Entire villages built with such cozy density that privacy barely existed and warmth was everyone's shared responsibility. Essentially, winter was a group project, and you couldn't opt out. Take, for instance, the medieval English hall house, found snuggled among frost-draped thatch roofs and sleepy livestock. These were surprisingly social structures, the open-plan living, rooms of the 14th century, centered around a great hearth that roared like a dragon with a chest cold. The hearth wasn't just for dramatic ambience. It was the solitary furnace fighting off the biting chill. Smoke curled lazily into the high rafters before escaping through nothing more than a hole in the roof, giving the upper beams a cozy coating of soot and a very generous seasoning of creosote. Ideal for those who found modern insulation too. Breathable. But warmth was not just a matter of blazing logs. It was strategic. Beds were often clustered near the hearth, sharing heat like spooning hedgehogs. And above, the sleeping loft, the medieval equivalent of bunk beds for grown-ups, trapped rising warmth. Sure, it also trapped smoke, but in the game of warmth versus lungs, warmth usually won. The result? Roasted shins, smoked nostrils, and lots of accidental nighttime grilling. Deliciously uncomfortable, but undeniably warm. In colder regions, things got more, shall we say, intimate. The Icelandic turf house is a masterclass in using what little you've got. Think Hobbiton with more sheep and fewer second breakfasts. These homes were buried under thick layers of earth and mossy turf, making them look like the landscape had developed a modesty problem and pulled its blanket up over its shoulders. Walls made of stone or timber were sandwiched in spongy green insulation, courtesy of Mother Nature herself. The turf absorbed heat from the central fire pit and radiated it slowly, like a lazy sun chuckling through lava rocks. Inside, families huddled together in a single main room. It wasn't just for camaraderie. Body heat was currency, affection was insulation, and arguments had to be whispery and brief so as not to let the warmth escape. The medieval dream. Now, over in Russia, warmth was treated like a full contact sport. Enter the pechka, or traditional masonry stove, known lovingly by historians as that enormous thing with fire in it. These were not simply fireplaces. These were nap-worthy, dinner-cooking, sock-drying cathedrals of brick and brick-adjacent materials, often large enough for someone to sleep on top. Yes, it was a stove. Yes, it doubled as a bed. And yes, Babushka always got first dibs on the warmest corner, because she fought in 6 consecutive winters and could probably start a fire with her side eye alone. The Russian peasant hut, or izba, practically revolved around the stove. When not stoking it or stewing something on it, the family might lounge on top of it, like particularly ambitious sourdough loaves. Windows were tiny, not out of aesthetic minimalism, but because glass was expensive and wind was free. If you happened upon an open window in a Russian winter, someone was likely being evicted, but for true insulation enthusiasts, few rivals dared compete with the Inuit of the Arctic. In an environment where snow falls sideways and anyone over 6 feet tall disappears into their moustache by February, these resilient folks said, "Snow house, sounds cozy." The igloo wasn't a novelty. It was a marvel of thermodynamics, a dome-shaped snow structure that could keep the interior a surprisingly comfortable 0 degrees Celsius, a full 40 degrees warmer than the air outside. The compacted snow walls trapped heat while small oil lamps added both warmth and an ambience that whispered, "Please don't forget to vent the roof." Inhabitants slept on raised platforms of ice covered in animal skins, a minimalist decor chosen for both practicality and the alarming lack of recorded interior designers in the Arctic. The warmth came not just from the architecture, but from community, seal oil, and the unspoken understanding that no one would mention anyone's winter breath. It was powerful. From the swampy thatch of medieval Britain to the frostbitten geometry of the Arctic igloo, humanity found ways to outwit cold centuries before Home Depot sold fiberglass in rolls. There was no thermostat to adjust, just fire, ingenuity, and a lot of close-quarter sniffing. And still, as the fire died down and the smoke curled upward into the night sky, there remained one more ally in the fight against winter's teeth, the humble bed covering, or more accurately, the mountainous fluff fortress we'd come to call bedding. Even before central heating made cozy warmth as easy as pressing a button, or, in truly decadent situations, summoning Alexa, people had found rather creative ways to fend off winter's frosty fingers. And while some of their methods might seem a tad primitive through our window-insulated 21st century eyes, back then They were acts of domestic genius. Let us softly crack open the shutters on one particular old ally in the war against winter, the hearth. It wasn't just a fireplace. No, it was the beating heart of the entire home. With its constant crackle and glow, it served as heater, stove, light source, and occasionally a spot for introspective brooding or melodramatic sighs. In many households, especially in pre-industrial Europe and the American colonies, the hearth was the command center, more essential than the front door, and arguably more psychologically stabilizing than tea. Houses were typically built around it, quite literally. In a medieval English hall house, for instance, the central hearth had no chimney, just a hole in the roof and a vaguely optimistic attitude toward where the smoke might go. Early versions of the fireplace might seem like fire hazards by today's standards, and indeed, countless thatched roofs met an ashy fate, but they were vital in heating up the marketplace of ideas, and also the porridge. Now, let's wander north for a moment, into the chillier reaches of Scandinavia, where Vikings had housing sorted in the form of longhouses. These wooden structures could stretch to the length of a modern bowling alley, and inside them lived a full spectrum of life. Families, livestock, and heat, all snuggled up together like one big, slightly smelly, happy family. The central fire pit burned constantly, sometimes even through the summer months, not just for warmth, but to dry clothes, cook food, and ward off any passing Norse ghosts, or perhaps relatives overstaying their welcome. Interestingly, the smoke from those fires, which one might assume to be horribly unpleasant, had the curious double role of curing meat and driving out insects. It was a kind of Northern European potpourri, eau de brisket and ash. Across the Channel in France, things took a somewhat more refined turn. The French naturally developed fireplaces with chimneys earlier than most. By the Renaissance, wealthy homes featured elaborately carved hearths, flanked by grotesque lions and saints, who presumably had no qualms watching your stew bubble. And these fireplaces didn't just heat. They ostentatiously declared, "Yes, I do own a manor, please admire my chimney flue." But even as homes grew more sophisticated, the limitations of fireplace heating were rather obvious. Rooms farthest from the flame, like bedrooms or anything called a parlour, remained cold enough to qualify as amateur morgues. People had to get creative, hence bed curtains. Not for drama, mind you, although there's no shame in feeling like royalty while shivering under linen. Four-poster beds with heavy drapes served a very practical purpose, keeping body heat trapped in a small microclimate of warmth. In essence, they were human terrariums with a soft cotton perimeter. Some beds, known charmingly as box beds, enclosed the sleeper entirely, like climbing into a cupboard and briefly pretending you're bread trying to rise overnight. Elsewhere, wealthier households employed an army of problem solvers. There were foot warmers, little metal boxes filled with embers, to be tucked under skirts or slippers. There were bed warmers too, long-handled pans filled with coals, slid between the sheets like a fiery bedtime butler. And, in a particular stroke of genius masquerading as mild lunacy, people in cold regions would heat bricks or stones in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and pop them beneath the covers. Because nothing says sleep like a toasty rock whispering sweet dreams to your feet. But perhaps the most time-tested heating method of all was simply the proximity of other humans, or animals. Yes, humans have spent centuries spooning each other for warmth, not necessarily for affection, though one could lead to the other, and occasionally to 9 children. It was communal thermodynamics. In peasant cottages, families might all share one bed, along with the dog, the cat, and a chicken that just wouldn't take no for an answer. In truth, the world before insulation was not so much about heating spaces as it was about heating people. And tomorrow, even as roofs remain uninsulated and windows are mere hopeful suggestions against the wind, we'll take a look at how materials, no matter how humble, became the secret agents of warm survival. Straw, mud, moss. Oh yes, we're just getting cozy. Flickering firelight danced along the rough-hewn beams of ancient ceilings, casting sleepy shadows on stone and plaster. Materials that, despite their stoic silence, weren't exactly brilliant at keeping out the cold. Tonight, we float gently into the world of windows. Those curious openings in old walls, occasionally mistaken for glorified holes that let the wind whistle goodnight lullabies directly into your ear canal. You see, in the grand, drafty theatre of historic architecture, the window has always been complicated. Today, we lift a digitless toast to the good old days when glass was a luxury, panes were tiny, and cold air had VIP access. If you were a medieval peasant, let's say Farmer Edgar, known regionally for his robust turnip yield and unparalleled ability to ignore frostbite. Windows were not so much about letting in light, but keeping things like wolves, witches, or that horrible neighbor Gregory out. And what would you be peering through? Likely not glass. Maybe oiled parchment, stretched animal bladder, or, if you were very lucky, a tiny disc of crown glass. Crown glass, now there's a marvel. Imagine, if you will, a molten blob of glass spun lovingly by hand into a wide, thin disc. Think pizza dough, but dangerous. Once cooled, the disc was chopped into small panes, the least distorted ones commandeered by the wealthy, and the bubbly, swirly middle, the bullseye, became the window pane equivalent of a budget airline seat, functional but distorted, and generally used by those less financially fussy. But let's not scoff too hastily. These small, thick panes helped in one important way. Their very imperfection minimized heat loss. And by minimized, I of course mean still leaked terribly, just slightly slower than an open barn door. Window shutters, those underappreciated wooden guardians, played a much bigger role. On stormy nights in, say, 1643, a good oak shutter was your first line of defense against biting gusts, airborne sheep, or the occasional confused cavalryman. In fact, homes often had interior shutters as well, great planks of wood that folded in from the sides and latched with a satisfying medieval thunk. They didn't just block wind, they were insulation by brute force. Now, let me tell you about the people with actual glass windows. The elite, the clergy, anyone who didn't have to personally shoe their own oxen. Their windows were still tiny by modern standards, often leaded into diamond shapes like a kaleidoscope made by someone who hated clarity. But my, didn't they look grand? Of course, no matter how fancy your glass, it steamed up the minute you exhaled within 5 feet of it. Condensation would freeze into dainty ice ferns by bedtime, a sort of seasonal art exhibit brought to you by the laws of thermodynamics. Over in 18th century Edinburgh, they developed something quite charming. Window tax, that's right. Homeowners were taxed based on how many windows they had. The logic? More windows, more wealth. The result? Bricked over windows everywhere. Some buildings look like they got halfway through a game of Architectural Connect 4 before giving up in despair. In fairness, fewer windows did help reduce heat loss. Not entirely by choice, of course, but serendipitous nonetheless. And then there were the felty window fixes of the common folk. Old cloths stuffed into cracks, blankets hung like curtains. And in deeply rural areas, windows were covered for the entire winter with tightly sealed sacks or even boards. Think of it as turning your house into the reverse of a greenhouse. No light in, all cold out. Festive in a deeply practical way. Meanwhile, in places like Russia and Scandinavia, double windows became the fashion. Not because it was stylish, but because your eyelashes might freeze shut indoors if you didn't double up. These clever folk installed a second frame of glass just inside the first. Dead air trapped in between, like a polite winter buffer. But for all their efforts, old windows were no match for modern insulation. They squeaked, they dripped, they leaked songs of the wind into every chamber. Yet somehow, wrapped in heavy gowns, sleeping by the fire, or under piles of furs that could double as portable family crypts, people endured. As the early frost crept along the edges of each pane, there was poetry in the crackle of shutters closing for the night, in the way lamplight flickered across frost-blown sills. Let's now drift gently from the windows to the walls themselves, those thick and stubborn sentinels, built not for comfort, but for permanence. Because what those walls lacked in warmth, they certainly made up for in sheer medieval determination. Of all the places in history to feel a draft, medieval castles ranked disturbingly high on the list. Picture a vast stone hallway echoing with every shuffled slipper, the torchlight flickering like it's nervous to be there. These mighty fortresses were magnificent in stature and beautifully impractical in winter. Ah, the medieval vision of home comfort. Soaring ceilings, impenetrable walls, and an interior climate system designed by no one at all. You see, stone is excellent for withstanding a siege but hopeless at snuggling. It holds onto cold with the possessiveness of a toddler gripping a toy sword. The walls were thick, yes, with two C's, but not in the cozy sense. In winter, they radiated cold like a moody noble sighing about taxes. No insulation meant that heat, wherever it dared to exist, fled as fast as a jester who told the wrong joke at dinner. So how did castle dwellers manage, apart from complaining bitterly and inventing soup? For those who didn't have the good sense to be born in Italy, where at least you had the Mediterranean pretending to be a heater, there were coping strategies, or as they were more commonly known, ways not to freeze all night. Let us first discuss the humble fireplace, grand, stony, and frequently useless beyond arm's reach. Yes, they lit fires, often massive ones, but unless you were standing dangerously close, which many did until their eyebrows singed, the fireplace only heated two things: the front of you and your overly ambitious dreams. The back, naturally, remained an icicle. To improve this dire situation, someone eventually invented the hooded fireplace and the chimney flue. Before that, most homes simply let the smoke drift upward, coiling around rafters and cooking slow meals out of the lungs of everyone present. Once chimneys became common, or at least mildly better than smoke blindness, fires began to lose slightly less heat to the open air. A step forward, a small, sputtering step. Then came tapestries, not just decorative, mind you. These embroidered marvels, often hanging from walls, served as medieval insulation. Rich in thread and warmer than bare stone, they helped trap stray body heat and muffle the castle's ambitious echoes. They were basically the medieval version of wallpaper if wallpaper cost a fortune, and occasionally told long stories about unicorns and dragons. For beds, which in winter were not so much places to rest as survival pods, there were canopies, not just for looking royal, although let's be honest, that didn't hurt, but to trap heat. Heavy drapes would be drawn closed around the bed, like a curtain at the end of a tragic play, sealing in body warmth while simultaneously dampening snores. Bedfellows were common, for warmth, for company, and for an unspoken competition of who can outsleep the cold. Interestingly enough, layering didn't stop at clothing. People layered rugs on floors, skins on benches, and sometimes even clothes on themselves, over their clothes. A medieval winter outfit was not so much an ensemble as a wearable bunker. If you removed something and could still move your arms, you weren't done dressing yet. In homes outside castles, cottage and timber dwellings, survival often relied more on sheer proximity. Cottages were small, delightfully so in winter. Less space to heat, more bodies to crank up the room temperature by, well, existing. Livestock, too, helped. In some arrangements, cows lived under the floor or in a room off the side. Not romantically cozy, perhaps, but functionally toasty. There's nothing like the smell of hay, mud, and dairy to say welcome home. Even simple design tweaks helped. Many traditional homes had low ceilings to keep warm air from rising out of reach, and thick curtains to block drafts from single glass or non-existent windows. In some Nordic traditions, beds were built into walls like little shelves for humans, enclosed on 3 sides to preserve body heat and privacy if you were lucky. All of this paints a romantic, if slightly damp, picture of resilience. People didn't just tough it out. They layered, covered, huddled, and innovated, not despite discomfort, but because of it. The result, a kind of everyday ingenuity that would make a modern HVAC system blush with gratitude. And just when we think we've wrapped ourselves up in every conceivable fabric of medieval warmth, we mustn't forget the final and possibly most glorious invention of the insomnia-prone mind, the bed warmer. A brass pan filled with glowing coals, shuffled between sheets with great care and considerable prayer. It could bring bliss or blisters, depending on your luck and your housemaid's reflexes. As embers settled and shutters rattled, homes survived winters not through insulation, but through adaptation, a daily dance of smoke, wool, and mild hypothermia. But perhaps the cleverest solution wasn't structural at all. No, it might have walked on 4 legs, meowed, and knew exactly which lap was warmest. Which reminds me, what about pets? Those ancient sleep companions with fur, attitude, and a sixth sense for finding the best spot by the fire. We should explore that next, before the candles burn out. Imagine it's 1731, in a small village somewhere in northern Europe, where the snow falls sideways, the wind howls like a werewolf on a juice cleanse, and the concept of central heating exists only in the fever dreams of chimney sweeps. You, dear sleeper, are living in a house constructed entirely of local stone, timber, and what can only be described as mildly cooperative mud. There is no such thing as insulation as we know it today. Nobody's popping down to the hardware store to pick up fiberglass bats or weather stripping. There is, however, a goose in the corner wearing a bonnet, and that seems to offer some psychological comfort. Here's the frosty truth. People use thermal layering not just on themselves, but on their homes. They learned, rather bravely, to build houses that understood the winter, and when that wasn't enough, they simply outstubborned the cold. One of the key strategies was to make buildings that held heat in surprising ways. For example, the iconic longhouses of Northern Europe. Think, one giant room with everyone, including the livestock, cozied up together under a single, somewhat leaking roof. Yes, cows inside the house. This wasn't a sign of poverty or poor judgment. It was thermal engineering with hooves. Animals produce heat. Put them near your living space, and voila, you've got central mooting. Their breath and body warmth would help raise the ambient temperature. Plus, your feet stayed delightfully toasty when you shared your bed with a goat, assuming it didn't eat your pillow in the night. The thick walls of these homes, made from wattle and daub or heavy stone, held onto what little heat was made. There were tiny windows, if any, to reduce drafts, and doors were designed like puzzles. You know that modern feeling of a door, gracefully swinging open on polished hinges? Forget that. These doors required encouragement, elbow grease, and occasionally a well-placed shoulder, but they closed tight. Inside, the fireplace bore full responsibility for warmth. A bit dramatic, yes, but fireplaces of the 17th and 18th centuries were hulking masses built of brick or stone, designed not just to cook your porridge, but to retain and slowly radiate heat long after the fire went out. Large hearths not only heated the cooking pot, but the communal soul. People gathered close like marshmallows on the brink of becoming s'mores, swapping stories while slowly rotating like rotisserie chickens. And above those hearths, in the less fashionable realm near the exposed beams, were often dried herbs, hanging meats, and sometimes a sleeping ledge, a small spot high above the fire where warmth lingered. If you were lucky, or youngest, you might be tucked there for the night, like a loaf of bread set out to rise. Meanwhile, bedding played a heroic role. Beds were piled high with quilts, furs, and wool-stuffed mattresses so lofty they required a minor climbing expedition to get in each night. In especially thrifty households, folks slept 2 or even 3 to a bed. Not for the gossip though, that was a perk, but for warmth. It was not uncommon for people to wear much of their wardrobe to bed. Nightcaps, thick socks, even mittens made appearances under the covers. You didn't just sleep, you cocooned. And oh, let us not forget the bed curtain. This magical invention turned your bed into a miniature room, trapping body heat in the coziest of forts. The 1700s, where your bedside privacy was also your survival plan. In colder climates, families developed charming customs to get through hard winters. There was the strategic sitting order around the fire. Elders in front, kids in the back, cats anywhere they pleased. There was the tastefully named bed warmer, a metal pan filled with coals, slid between the sheets and guaranteed to make your bed feel mildly less like a vault at a dairy farm. And there were the heated stones, which doubled as both bedtime companions and medieval hot water bottles, though slightly rockier. Were any of these systems efficient by modern standards? Not remotely. But there's something rather lovely in imagining the quiet resourcefulness of winter survival. A certain intimacy blooms when you have to huddle together to stay warm, when every quilt, ember, and snoring sheep is part of your heating strategy. Of course, while the hearths warmed hearts and the livestock refused to observe boundaries, another innovation would soon make quite the toasty difference. And no, it's not just more goats, but we'll get to that. Tomorrow, perhaps, when your eyes are open and the snow is no longer tapping gently at the window panes of your imagination. As the first frost feathered over the thatched rooftops and icicles began staging their annual descent from wayward eaves, medieval people across Europe ushered themselves not into thermostated dens with wall-to-wall carpet, but rather into spaces that, well, could generously be described as enthusiastically drafty. Yet they survived quite miraculously, winter after winter, and did so while wearing what amounted to several layers of itchy drapery and a defiant attitude. The secret? In part, it was something that nearly every past society mastered with quiet genius: room compression. You see, Historical homes often shrank in size, not physically, though wouldn't that have been something, but spatially, as families and activities consolidated into 1 or 2 rooms during the colder months. Large manor houses suddenly felt cozier as noble families huddled near the hearth, servants pressed closer to the kitchen fires, and any room without a heat source was politely ignored all season, like that one uncle who talks politics at dinner. This was the era of the Great Chamber Migration. Fine palatial halls would be abandoned for the warming pan and woolen embrace of smaller inner rooms, which, when layered with heavy curtains and thick carpets, usually hung on the walls, mind you, transformed into respectable refugees against the howling cold. Yes, in a twist that would confuse modern decorators, tapestries weren't just for storytelling or bragging rights, though many did involve a heroic knight and a suspicious number of unicorns. They were insulation. Fancy, medieval, woven insulation. Even ceilings might be drooped with fabric swaths known as bed hangings, not only over the bed itself, but in wealthier homes, across whole rooms. In essence, they recreated the cozy warmth of a tent inside their own homes. A peculiar solution, but much appreciated by toes and noses alike. Let us now tiptoe into the peasant's cottage, where cleverness was less ornate but equally determined. These humble homes, often timber-framed with walls packed in wattle and daub, a material that sounded more like a Dickensian law firm and less like insulation, were not precisely airtight. Indeed, sleeping in one during mid-January was akin to spending the night in a very polite barn, with holes. But necessity, ever the mother of invention, and some might argue knitting, paved the way for pragmatic solutions. Windows, if they existed, were often covered with oiled cloth or thin animal horn panels, which allowed light in but, more importantly, kept the bitter winds out. Drafts from below were kept at bay with strewn rushes or straw on the floor, or sometimes even with a thick loaf of rush matting, which sounds suspiciously bready but was, in fact, room-wide floor stuffing. Still, there was no substitute for proximity. If you were chilly, the best technology available was 2 parts body heat and 1 part climb into bed with the rest of the family. Yes, it wasn't uncommon for whole households, children, adults, grandparents, a wayward cousin or two, to sleep in the same bed, nestled under layers of woolen covers and the occasional dog. And should someone be lucky enough to own a sheep, cow, or goat, the barn became less of a livestock shelter and more like a biological heating unit. A warm cow nearby was better than any radiator. Swedish farmers even perfected this principle with their cow under the floor house design, where the animals lived below the living quarters, their heat rising up through the wooden boards in a kind of early geothermal experiment involving cud. In Greenlandic turf homes, Inuit snow huts, and the stone black houses of Scotland's Hebrides, the principle was the same. Keep it small, low, layered, and densely populated with warm things, namely people and anything remotely resembling a mammal. Meanwhile, coats, cloaks, and capes often doubled as blankets. Nightcaps weren't a fashion statement, nor a way to signal to your spouse that bedtime had officially begun. They were crucial for keeping sparse heat from escaping your understandably frustrated head. You might not look like a fashion icon, but at least your ears wouldn't snap off. And while central heating would have sounded like a luxury from the realm of dragons, medieval innovation kept people wrapped in a hat and hearth ecosystem that, however smoky and sneeze-inducing, kept them alive, and somewhat miraculously, even asleep. As we close the creaky wooden door on our cozy, cacophonic medieval winter dwellings, hush now, there's more warmth to be found, not just in ingenuity, but in what people used to wrap themselves in long before fleece was even invented. Windows. We tend to think of them as the eyes of a house. Little clear portals framed in cheerful curtains, faithfully keeping an eye out for mailmen or squirrels with a vendetta. But in winter's battleground of the pre-insulated age, windows were much more than gentle daylight dispensers. They were a menacing architectural weak spot, drafty, delicate, and about as effective at keeping the cold out as a lace doily in a snowstorm. Now, step back with me into a frosted 17th century village. It's early morning. Frost clings like ancient lace to every thatched rooftop. A sleepy figure lifts a candle near a window and scratches a bewildered message into the frost with a fingernail, and then sighs because once again, the glass has frozen on the inside. Yes, dear listener, inside. Before you treat this as a malfunction of craftsmanship, remember, glass was handmade, expensive, and often a little wobbly, like soup seen through jelly. It rarely sealed well. In fact, fixed, non-opening windows were more for decoration or basic daylight than insulation, and those who could afford to have real glazed windows often still preferred to lock them down with heavy shutters at night. The glass may have let in sunshine, but those timber shutters were the real MVPs of heat defense. Interestingly, many medieval and early modern homes didn't have glazed glass windows at all. Some had oiled cloth stretched over wooden frames. Yes, windows made of waxed linen, delicately translucent and permanently unsure whether they were curtains or walls. Others used flattened animal horn, translucentish, toughish, and very much a conversation starter. If you lived in Northern Europe during these frigid centuries, you didn't just walk over and crack open a window to air out the chamber. More commonly, you hunched away from them. Drafts made windows sacred spaces where nobody sat unless they had accidentally lost a game of musical stools, which, incidentally, was not a game, but the natural result of lacking chairs. Some households wouldn't even risk glass. They'd remove a window entirely every spring, replacing it with, well, nothing, and only reinstalling a translucent covering around autumn. This upkeep became a seasonal ritual, like putting snow tires on your ox cart. In wealthier homes, you might see horn windows fitted not with cloth, but with teeny wooden frames, each segment brass-nailed and time-tested. These installations looked like stained glass dreamed up by someone on a budget and a deadline. And shutter systems were essential. Interior shutters, sometimes double-layered, would be closed each afternoon like a dignified curtain call, sometimes with old rags stuffed around the seams in an act of domestic desperation masquerading as elegance. Now, if you're picturing cold wind whistling through timber gaps, you're entirely correct. It did whistle, and whimper, and sometimes scream, depending on how offended it was that humans had dared to build square houses in its preferred parade routes. So, to battle the chill seeping through these rickety windows, families developed methods best described as collective huddling. People slept close to one another under mountains of wool, fur, and occasionally things that used to be curtains. Window beds, those lovely, semi-enclosed sleeping nooks tucked into corners, weren't just charming. They were subtle acts of heat-hoarding genius. Being bracketed in on four sides meant fewer points of cold air intrusion, and also fewer exits, which deterred midnight snackers from leaving the warmth except under royal decree. And yes, glass improved. Over time, window makers discovered how to make panes flatter, clearer, and cheaper, although windows remained modest in size until well after the industrial era. Putting in too big a window was like declaring full-on hostilities with the weather, even in the Georgian era, when elegance called for big bay windows and symmetry with a capital S. Many of the homes still included thick internal shutters, cleverly disguised with trim work. They could be pulled shut in winter to reinforce the room against the long, frigid night. A Georgian drawing room may have looked dainty at first glance, but at bedtime, it turned into a fortress of foldable flaps and quietly muttered complaints about the draft. So next time you hear the wind howling outside and you're grateful for your double-glazed panes and heated slippers, remember the villagers of yesteryear brushing frost off their candlelit horns, stuffing sheep's wool into window corners, and inventing new ways to be both cold and purposeful. And while we wrap ourselves snugly here, the story tiptoes onward, toward the mighty hearth, and the curious art of medieval fire burning that was far smokier and far stranger than you'd expect. As winter's breath settled over Europe like a frosty quilt, an unassuming hero quietly came to the aid of countless toes and fingertips: the humble bed warmer. Before you conjure up an image of a hot water bottle wrapped in flannel, allow me to introduce its ancestor, a metal pan on a stick, heated with glowing coals and passed lovingly between the sheets. Far from being a posh accessory reserved for manor houses, bed warmers became a staple in any household that dared occupy a drafty room when snowflakes began their seasonal ballet. They were the night's ambassadors of warmth, clanking gently through hallways at bedtime like tiny metallic sleighs. Picture it. The fire is dying low in the hearth, casting soft flickers on hand-hewn beams. Outside, the wind gnaws at the shutters like a dog with a bone. Inside, you, or a plucky domestic assistant, take up the brass bed warmer, now brimming with embers, and slip it between the sheets, sliding it slowly across the bed like you're icing a cake with fire. There's a fine art to using one. Move too slowly, and you scorch the linen. Move too quickly, and all you've done is stir the cold around like a ghost with an agenda. The goal was a bed that was neither charred nor chilly, just perfectly toasty in the middle and gradually awakening at the corners, like the first sips of hot tea on a cold morning. Interestingly, the bed warmer was not without its critics. Anxious pamphleteers in the 18th century worried about the dangers of carbon monoxide. They were also a bit miffed at the idea of burning wood to heat something that technically wasn't a person. Environmental guilt, it seems, is not an invention of the 21st century. But alas, cold feet won the debate most nights. In particularly clever households, a side innovation appeared: the warming pan with holes. Yes, dear listener, they perforated the bottom. Why? So that the ashes didn't settle inside and increase the chance of bedding going up in flames. Safety, fashion, and a slight scratchy sound against the sheets, all in one glorious tool. And if you think bed warmers were simply for warming beds, think again. In the world of double duty, they sometimes warmed the nightclothes too. Nothing quite like slipping into preheated garments to soften the existential chill of getting dressed in a room where your breath looks like speech bubbles. Then there were soapstone warmers, a bit posher and slightly more sophisticated. Solid stones heated by the hearth, then wrapped in cloth and tucked into foot warmers, ovens, or, yes, beds. They glowed with the serene warmth of things that don't catch fire easily, which granted them a place of honor in many New England bedrooms. Even chamber pots, bless their unsung utility, were sometimes warmed before use. It's inadvisable to mix up the chamber pot and the bed warmer, I should add, a mistake you'd only make once. Naturally, bed warmers were a bit of a status symbol. Beautifully polished brass in wealthy homes, tin or iron for the frugal or less fussed. Many were passed down through generations, acquiring the patina of time and the occasional dent from being dropped during an especially cold midnight shuffle. It's worth noting that bed warmers also became the subject of folk remedies. In some rural villages, they believed the warmth could ward off rheumatism or draw out the night colds. This is mostly based on the genuinely pleasant experience of sleeping warmly. But if your grandmother said so, who are you to argue? Eventually, bed warmers found themselves gently retired as hot water bottles, then electric blankets crept onto the scene. But those industrious little pans had centuries of service. They too deserve a warm place in the annals of domestic history. And as the embers dim now in our imaginary warming pan, let's snuff out the coals and tuck it quietly back beside the hearth. Somehow, in an age without insulation, central heating, or electrically heated socks, people still managed a cozy slumber, more or less. Now then, speaking of heating things up without setting them ablaze, wait until we visit the curious case of the Russian stove. Part furnace, part loaf-in couch, thoroughly brilliant, and not a coal pan in sight. If you were to tiptoe into a medieval peasant's cottage on a frigid January morning, don't worry. We'll imagine you're invisible and immune to time travel paradoxes. You'd be met with a curious collection of survival decisions that range from clever to, well, surprisingly pungent. Let's begin with what you might notice first. The smell. A stew of wood smoke, damp wool, fermenting foods, farm animals, and unwashed humans. Not exactly a spa, but functional. For there, under low timbered ceilings coated with soot, the very air itself was part of the insulation strategy. The smoky haze trapped beneath the thatched eaves wasn't just a byproduct of an enthusiastic fire. It was thermal strategy meets accidental seasoning. That smoke curled up and clung to the rafters, filling every crack and cranny with the kind of permanence that modern insulation specialists could only dream of, albeit with significantly fewer coughing fits. And then there was the hearth, the center of warmth, food, and life. The fireplace in a medieval or early modern home was not delicately simmering away like some Pinterest cottagecore fantasy. It was roaring, sparking, and occasionally belching embers like an angry dragon in a hurry to roast your dinner and your foot. But crucially, it was the one and only reliable source of heat. Families, and sometimes their animals, would cluster around it like moths, hands outstretched, toes nudging dangerously close to the coals. The further you moved from the hearth, the faster your dreams of thawed toes froze into distant memories. Many homes had no internal walls, not because people loved the open concept aesthetic, but because wood was expensive and privacy was considered suspicious at best. A family of 6, plus perhaps a goat named Beatrice, lived, slept, and occasionally bickered around the fire. Body heat, as it turns out, is very effective insulation when there are enough bodies. And goats. Goats are surprisingly good heaters, especially the cuddly kind that doesn't mind sleeping at your feet. Clothing, too, was strategy, not style. Layering was the rule of thumb. Linen undergarments under woolen tunics, under cloaks, under more wool. Fashion was less a statement and more of a defensive maneuver against frostbite. Nightcaps weren't just for Scrooge, they were genuinely essential. Heat escapes cruelly from heads, and nobody wants a scalp frost. Inspired by nature, people also turned to fur when they could get their mitts on it. Bear pelts, fox stoles, rabbit-lined mittens, worn or laid across drafty floorboards like some very effective, very judgmental area rugs. Yet even in the chill-fighting world of furs, some communities found more inventive solutions. In the chillier corners of Scandinavia, for instance, homes were often built partially underground. Turf houses, affectionately known as hobbit holes to modern eyes. Dirt, that humble substance, proved one of the best insulators of all when stacked over thick stone or timber. Warm inside, snow-capped outside, these homes cocooned their inhabitants with a whispering hush that suggested the earth itself was tucking you into bed. In the Alps, folks went for block-bow houses, log cabins stacked like oversized Lincoln logs, thick-walled and tightly joined, often stuffed with moss in the cracks to discourage chilly whispers of wind. Once again, moss. The plant you might ignore on a damp rock was moonlighting as weatherproof cork. Nature, you see, had plenty to offer, if you didn't mind being covered in it most of the time. Urban houses had slightly different tricks up their cold sleeves. In Elizabethan England, for example, houses were often crammed tightly side by side in such close proximity that thieves passed through neighbours' chimneys just to avoid street patrols. But their snugness had another benefit: shared walls, less surface area exposed to the elements. One house's fireplace might warm the adjoining wall of another. Insulation by mutual inconvenience. And yes, windows. Or perhaps, more accurately, the absence of them. Glass, where it existed, was rare and often wavy. You weren't exactly getting scenic mountain views. More commonly, windows were covered with greased paper, cloth, or thin horn. You could see vague shapes, but little else, and you certainly weren't letting in any warm breezes because, in January, there weren't any. All of this grand annual ballet against winter's chill, boiled down to one truth. Humans, especially cold ones, are very clever creatures. They may not have had central heating or thermal panels, but what they lacked in technology, they made up for in layers, proximity, and a slightly exaggerated distrust of open air. But of course, cleverness often came with consequences. And when houses got too cozy, too smoky, and too populated, something else crept in. Not the cold, but the pestilence. In the next whisper of our fire-lit journey, we'll tiptoe deeper into how keeping out the winter sometimes let in other little guests. By the flickering light of a sputtering oil lamp, smudged cheeks and chilled hands once gathered around a rather mystical contraption. The bed warmer. A deceptively charming device. It consisted of a long-handled pan, usually brass with tiny decorative holes. Holes that politely threatened second-degree burns if one wasn't careful. This pan was filled with glowing embers or hot stones and then slipped between bed linens, waved about with a hopeful flourish in the direction of warmth. It was, in essence, a literal fire hazard masquerading as bedtime luxury. For many, this humble bed warmer carried the promise of surviving the first 5 minutes under icy sheets, minutes otherwise filled with whimpering, toe-curling, and existential regret, before the electric blanket or the blessed click of central heating. These ember-stuffed pans were the nocturnal heroes of drafty cottages and timber-framed manors alike. But even before bed warmers clanked from hearth to mattress, the real heroes of late-night warmth were not devices, but manor servants, those fleet-footed frost warriors who risked singed eyebrows and disapproving glares to preheat their employer's bedding. They'd dash with the pan, avoiding any sudden tilts, because nothing says "Good evening, Sir Gregory," quite like a small ember-fueled fire in his linen sheets. Though bed warmers were well loved, they were accompanied by a rather medieval entourage of related cold-defying customs. Enter the humble hot brick, a standard, no-nonsense slab of masonry. It was heated, often in the fireplace, wrapped in flannel and tucked at one's feet. Primitive, sure, but oh so effective. Plus, fewer accidental fires. Then there were soapstones, dense volcanic rocks, whose claim to fame was retaining heat longer than a Victorian scandal clung to the morning paper. These wonder stones were heated during the day, placed into charmingly hand-sewn wool bags, and tucked into beds, cribs, or if you were truly fancy, your carriage. Like travelling with a lava muffin. And let's take a detour into the snug burrows of the 17th century Netherlands. Dutch foot stoves, wooden boxes with vents, lined with metal and hot coals, sat proudly beneath pews during frigid church services. Socks soaked less in the Word of God, and more in the small miracle of radiant warmth wafting from below. These same stoves huddled beneath desks, wagons, and yes, beds. And if you're wondering whether a foot stove could turn into a questionable bedtime companion, the answer is yes. People got attached. Some wrote poems. Of course, aside from open flame contraptions, human ingenuity leaned into layering with extraordinary dedication. Sleeping caps gave a helping hand or head against the night's chill. These weren't the gravity-defying pom-pom-wielding caps found in cartoons, but soft, knitted wool creations that covered every inch of scalp, ears included. A bald head without a cap. That was the 18th century version of reckless living. And while we now tuck into our duvets with smug lives free of frostbite, their precursor, the featherbed, deserves an ode. Layered atop firm mattresses and stuffed with goose downs so plush you could lose your will to rise in the morning. Featherbeds provided insulation and a touch of haughty luxury, provided you weren't allergic. Made from surplus feathers and sewn into thick ticking, it was the closest anyone got to sleeping in a warm cloud. That smelled a little like poultry. Even lowly peasants had their tricks. Primitive as they were, they'd often sleep with the family livestock nearby. Cows underneath the floorboards, pigs snoozing around the hearth. Not the most fragrant of arrangements, but undeniably toasty. Nothing says good night like the warm exhale of a dozing sheep wafting gently across your cheek. With these tools, stone, ember, feather, and sometimes a snoring bovine, the cold was kept outside, at least for long enough to dream. The air might have bitten through the walls of old stone cottages, but within those threadbare drapes and under patchwork quilts, winters were faced not with resignation, but with remarkable creativity. And somewhere behind those frosted windows, by the light of a dying ember in a brass pan, someone just like you cocooned themselves in layers of wool, flannel, and perhaps a scalding hot rock, all in the name of sleep. Now that you've met the bed warmers, soot-covered footmen, and their lava muffin companions, you might be wondering what it felt like to actually live in such a home, surrounded by flickering flames and creaking beams, gelid by design, yet stubbornly cozy. Let's open the creaky door next and step gently into the interior world of old homes where heat was hunted, hoarded, and never, ever wasted. As the bitter northern wind howled its familiar tune outside, the soul of the medieval longhouse was often held together, not by brick or beam, but by the unsung hero of winter survival, the central hearth. Ah, yes, the hearth. Not a decorative pottery barn accessory, but the literal beating heart of pre-modern family life. And much like Grandma's plastic-covered sofa, once you settle near it, you don't dare move. In homes from Northern Europe to the chilly steppes of Central Asia, the hearth was a fire pit placed sensibly smack dab in the middle of the room. Its design was simple enough. Stones, fire, and a whole lot of smoky ambition. There were no chimneys yet, not in the beginning at least. Smoke simply danced around the rafters for a while, casually insulting your lungs on its way out through holes in the thatched roof. Ever wonder why medieval peasants looked perpetually squinty in artwork? Smoke inhalation. It wasn't all plague, but the hearth wasn't just for warmth. No, it served an all-around purpose. Cooking, drying clothes, lighting the room, and somewhat less romantically, as a space heater for the chickens, who were either guests of the household or fully fledged roommates, depending on your class bracket. They clucked away beside you as you sipped broth and mentally prepared for another night of drafty slumber. Now, despite the fire's central location, heat distribution was more of a suggestion than a reality. Standing 2 feet closer meant the difference between thawed fingers and the solid icicle snap of medieval frostbite. Large families knew the drill. Oldest and grumpiest by the fire. Children and in-laws gradually exiled to the Arctic fringes of the room, where body heat and wishful thinking became survival strategies. It's difficult to appreciate from our central heated luxury, but a medieval evening was a full-blown Olympic sport of positioning. One didn't simply sit near the fire. You navigated it like a chessboard. The father, usually the appointed log turner, enjoyed the right of the prime seat. The dog naturally claimed the warmest tile and wouldn't move for fear of demotion. Everyone else just layered up. And there were layers aplenty. Cloaks, tunics, wool stockings, and cloaks again. Entire families slept in their daytime clothes, supplemented by blankets that bore more resemblance to rugs, or actual rugs, or, in especially festive households, actual sheep. The woolly beasts sometimes shared sleeping space purely for warmth. Unromantic? Yes. Effective? Definitely. In the larger homes of well-to-do nobles, heating took on more architectural flair. Some manor houses featured enormous stone fireplaces, aggressively large really. You could almost ride a horse through some of them. These luxurious heat engines even featured something new. Chimneys. Oh, the chimney. A sensibly vertical invention that sucked out the smoke while letting the warmth stay behind. Revolutionary. Quite literally. There's little like proper lung function to shift the tide of peasant morale. Yet even with fancier fireplaces, there was still little in the way of insulation. Drafts slipped through the cracks in stone, walls like mischievous sprites, tugging at hems and flapping tapestries. Extra-wide window shutters became critical. They weren't just to close off the outside world. They were meant to keep in the toasty whisper of the hearth. Curtains were added. Tapestries hung like insulation quilts. Some homes even featured fabric-lined wall paneling, like the Middle Ages' answer to indoor-outdoor carpeting, except vertical, and made mostly of wool, and probably slightly damp. Still, the hearth remained the axis mundi, the fire-centered universe around which daily life revolved. It was the news station, restaurant, furnace, and family meeting space in one. Heated bricks from the fire were occasionally wrapped in cloth and tucked into beds. Medieval hot water bottles, if you will. For those without bricks, there was always the option of boiling a stone. Yes, this was a thing. A stone-steamed bed might sizzle slightly upon entry, but it beat slipping between sheets of cold linen, with nothing but regret for company. In some parts of Eastern Europe and Russia, the idea of fire-warmed furniture went even further with the invention of the masonry stove, or pechka, enormous tile-clad behemoths of brick and fire. These were both cook stove and home furnace, and if built large enough, they doubled as beds. Picture it: a sleepy peasant curled up atop the stove, legs dangling, soup simmering below, and the night frost outside softened down to a tolerable chill. Comfort by sandwiching yourself between bricks. Ingenious, possibly lumpy, but by candlelight, everything feels cozier, doesn't it? And so, the nights dragged on. Outside, the wind might whistle like a nose with a cold, but inside, through smoke, soot, shepherds, and shifting body piles, the fire burned steadily, not prettily, but persistently. For all their chilly inconveniences, homes adapted to the seasons with a passion born of necessity, creativity, and the sheer refusal to freeze. So next, let's dim the light just a touch more and tiptoe into a place where warmth relied not on wood, but on sheer numbers, and the clever arrangement of very cold people trying very hard not to be. As the wind danced its haphazard waltz across the moors and settled frost upon the shutters, the Georgian fireplace emerged as civilization's crackling rebuttal to winter's advances. Ah yes, the hearth, that noble, smoky rectangle whose practical genius was matched only by its ability to make nearly every room smell faintly of soot and mutton for days. Long before central heating became the default luxury and radiators began to clang with questionable confidence, the fireplace was both hero and hazard. In Georgian England, it wasn't simply a box that burned things. It was the very beating heart of the home, both literally and metaphorically. And just like most beating hearts in that era, it often occupied a precarious position somewhere between cozy and catastrophic. The secret weapon behind this fiery centerpiece was a fellow named Count Rumford. And no, regrettably, he was not a fictional aristocrat invented by a cheese company. Count Rumford, also known as Benjamin Thompson, was a scientist and inventor with a flair for both thermodynamics and dramatically long coats. In the late 18th century, he revolutionized fireplace design by sloping the sides inward, raising the hearth, and crafting a narrower chimney throat. All suspiciously sensible modifications that redirected smoke upward instead of outward. A glorious improvement over the prior domestic norm, which one might kindly describe as indoor camping with a slight risk of asphyxiation. The Rumford fireplace became a favorite among the fashionably chilly elites of Britain and America. It mixed efficiency with elegance, and for the first time, you could warm your hands without needing to squint through a blur of smoke or cough like you'd swallowed a hedgehog. But the fireplace, refined or not, still faced a dilemma. Most of a fire's heat is terribly uncooperative. It escapes upward like a teenager with a new driver's license, vanishing out the chimney with very little regard for the shivering humans below. Only radiant heat, the kind that beams straight at you like sunshine for indoor optimists, stuck around to do anything useful. This meant those clever Georgians had to get strategic. Parlors and drawing rooms were arranged so the furniture faced the fire, like an audience attending an exceptionally temperamental performance by a log. People huddled in for warmth the way cats find the only sunny spot on the rug. It was communal heat, no insulation, no vents, just bodies, bricks, and good posture. At night, fires were banked, a practice which sounds vaguely financial but is, in fact, delightfully domestic. Glowing embers were tucked beneath ash to smolder through the night, ensuring an easier relight in the morning. This glowing coal cocoon was occasionally entrusted to children, who were instructed with solemn gravity not to poke it, stomp it, or attempt impromptu experiments. Compliance levels varied wildly. And of course, the fireplace was more than a heating device. It was a kitchen, a drying rack, a crude light source, and a social media hub before screens were invented. You could dry your socks, stew a hare, and gossip about the rector's suspicious onions, all without moving your frozen feet more than 2 inches. Architecturally, homes began sprouting chimneys with gleeful abandon. In earlier centuries, a house might get by with a single central hearth. But by the 18th century, chimneys had become domestic status symbols. If you had separate flues for your sitting room, your bedchamber, and your butler's melancholy, you had clearly arrived. However, this linear progress was accompanied by a few, shall we say, smouldering drawbacks. Chimneys were splendid heat thieves. The same draft that carried smoke out also invited icy air in. If your damper was open, or your understanding of thermodynamics was, the warmth might flee faster than your guests after one of Aunt Agatha's political rants. Still, ingenuity was everywhere. Some households hung thick woolen curtains over doorways to trap heat like a velvet barricade against Jack Frost. Others placed footmen, not the human kind, but small metal heaters under tables to warm the legs of diners who were otherwise at risk of freezing from the knees down while enjoying their cold beef pudding and tepid ale. Even bedrooms, those frigid sanctuaries of nightly survival, occasionally sported their own little hearths, but they were used sparingly. Lighting fires upstairs was either a luxury, a necessity, or a mistake, depending on your social class and insurance coverage. And so, winter was endured with the stoic charm of unwilling endurance and an eye for where the next hot brick might turn up. The fireplace kept people alive and just warm enough to compose long letters about how insufferably cold everything was. As evening settles deeper and the last embers crackle into whispers, our quiet exploration carries onward, toward walls stuffed with straw, builders with frostbitten beards, and the grey, slightly chilly magic of wattle and daub. Curl in. There's more warmth to be found ahead. While most modern minds might picture the Middle Ages as a frostbitten catastrophe of draughty castles and equally chilly attitudes, the truth is more, well, creatively pragmatic. You see, when external insulation was little more than a future fever dream and central heating hadn't even entered the chat, medieval folks relied on something bold, brilliant, and rather fuzzy. Layers. Glorious, glorious layers. Let's saunter quietly into a 14th century English longhouse, stomping the metaphorical snow from our imaginary boots. Inside, it is dim, but surprisingly snug. The walls are wattle and daub. That's an ancient way of saying sticks and mud in cozy union. A surprisingly decent insulator, if you don't mind the occasional mouse roommate. And perched in the center, like a loyal hearth dragon breathing warmth, is the fire. The open hearth was the lifeblood of the medieval home. Fill it with logs, coax the flames into a flickering dance, and suddenly everyone's cheeks have flushed with contentment. Yes, and possibly smoke too. Oddly enough, chimneys were still considered an architectural daydream at this point in time. So the smoke from the fire, well, it went up. Eventually, kind of. Most roofs had a small hole through which smoke would, in theory, wander out like a polite guest. In practice, smoke loitered. It gathered under the rafters in huffy grey clouds, flavouring everything with a hint of wood smoke, including people's wool tunics, their food, and, one imagines, their dreams. But this accidental smoke cocoon had an unintended upside. It helped preserve wooden beams and even discourage bugs who lacked a taste for smoky ambience. Truly a win-win for those who didn't mind living like a side of ham. Now glance around to the walls, adorned not with paint or pleasant tapestries, but with bundles of dried herbs, hanging tools, pots of mysterious ointments, and dragged-in hay, which sometimes lined the floor for extra warmth. Underneath those layers of burlap and woven mats, the bare earth floor didn't radiate heat so much as a gentle sense of purpose. It existed. It was solid. Don't expect it to be warm. What really made winter bearable, aside from the eternal companionship of a fire and smoke-baffled lungs, was togetherness. Big families and even animals, yes, animals, would overwinter together in shared spaces. Cows, sheep, perhaps a pig or two. These barnyard companions were like living radiators with hooves. Their presence warmed the room, filled it with the soft sounds of snuffling and chewing, and added what historians might call an unmistakable aroma. But in a pinch, a cow was superior to a blanket. Did individuals grumble? Of course. Did they complain about cold drafts and cough about smoke? Undoubtedly. But they also adapted in ways that bordered on genius. Featherbeds were stuffed to lumpen perfection. Cloaks were heavy and hooded. Foot wraps and fingerless gloves made every peasant into a fashion-conscious toasty burrito. Bedfellows bundled together not always out of romance, but instead sheer thermal necessity. In fact, a popular nighttime arrangement was the family bed, a pile of flannel and humanity under one shared linen fortress. And yes, it was warm and crowded and possibly loud. Lest you think this communal cocooning was unique to England or Europe, let's whisk our thoughts northwest to the icy reaches of Scandinavia. Here, Norse folk perfected home heat in their turf houses, earthen dwellings with walls and roofs quite literally made from the land. Turf houses were marvels of eco-insulation, packed with layers of soil and grass that trapped heat with mossy enthusiasm. One might rightly wonder if they invented the idea of the hobbit hole centuries early. Yet nesting underground wasn't a sign of primitive hardship. It was a stroke of eco-genius ahead of its time. Warm, secluded, and practically silent, save for the rumble of storm winds above, turf homes offered a peaceful winter slumber, interrupted only by the occasional goat pawing at the door. So, no, living without insulation wasn't a medieval misery march. It was a constantly evolving exercise in ingenuity, proximity, and an acute appreciation for your neighbor's body temperature. The humans of the past layered shepherd cloaks atop smoldering embers, animals beside ankles, and family upon family under scratchy wool. All in a great annual ritual of survival and snoozing. And as the snows blew against the wattle walls, and the hearth embers gently dimmed into whispers of heat, both peasants and lords alike turned, tucked, and drifted away, warmed by each other, by their meagre architecture, and by the quiet confidence that winter could be outlasted once again. Just ahead, we'll tiptoe into the slippery subject of historical heating hacks far beyond fireplaces, in places where fire itself was more mischief than comfort. As twilight settles gently over the salted rooftops of old Europe, we find ourselves wandering into a quieter corner of the past, one less concerned with kings and wars and far more intrigued by sheep. Yes, sheep. Woolly, stubborn, surprisingly heroic sheep. Because long before the age of pink fiberglass and energy efficiency ratings, the humble fleece of the ovine kind was leading the charge in home insulation. Let us step into a modest 17th century English cottage, cobbled walls, a thatched roof, and a front door that doubles as a seasoned draft expert. The house itself breathes or perhaps wheezes with the wind. But around the door frame, stuffed into chinks between stone and wood, is a surprise: tufts of wool. Not the pristine white variety you see in folktale illustrations, but a lanolin-rich, slightly musky patchwork of natural insulation. Farmers and their families knew well, if you had a sheep and a pair of shears, you had yourself a winter survival kit. Wool was practically a miracle material. Breathable, insulating even when damp, and passive-aggressively flame-resistant, an oddly specific trait that comforted many a hearthside napper. It was used not just for clothing, but for padding cold walls, stuffing mattresses, and lining boots. In fact, some historians believe the earliest European version of a sleeping bag was likely a simple sack of wool. Crawl in, cinch it tight, and you're the human equivalent of a meat pie. Now, of course, not everyone had the privilege of sheep ownership. In more urban settings, thrifty dwellers turned to a wider, smellier palette of organic insulation. Feathers, for example, not just for pillows, but sewn into panels of old cloth and pinned over windows in a flurry of late autumn panic. Old newspapers became precious commodities, not for reading, but for stuffing between floorboards. And in some particularly inventive circles, people even used dried moss or sawdust, depending on what was available and, more importantly, what wasn't currently alive. Let's journey further north now, to the log cabins dotting the frozen wilderness of 18th century Scandinavia and Siberia. These were the homes of real insulation artists. Absent central heating and flush with forest supply, northern cultures developed a method known as chinking, a poetic term that simply means they stuffed everything from mud to animal hair between those timber logs to keep out Jack Frost. The craftsmanship was often folk-level genius. Layers of moss pressed into every wooden crevice, moistened slightly so that, when frozen, it would harden into an icy yet sealed defense. Winter as insulation technology, only colder. In these regions, furs hung on the walls the way modern people hang abstract art. Reindeer hides served not only as bedding and wall liners, but as prized decor. The more hides on the wall, the more obvious your understanding of warmth and personal hierarchy. The wealthiest might even boast bare pelts, luxuriously displayed like a statement rug with teeth. But perhaps the coziest detail of this era's icy adaptation lies not in the materials, but in the human choreography around warmth. Families shared beds freely, not just for affection, but necessity. In many homes, a single bed could contain an entire family, layered like a lasagna of nightgowns and woolen blankets. Grandparents, children, dogs, and occasionally a chicken or two for thermal bonuses, all snoozed together, a communal heat battery humming under a feather-filled quilt. And yet, despite the drafty walls and the howling winds, people managed to sleep soundly. Because their homes, while not insulated by today's standards, were steeped in rhythms of living that modern insulation could hardly replicate. Proximity, patience, wool, and several generations' worth of experience in exactly where to put the hay bale when the blizzard came. As flickering candlelight casts long shadows across those ancient wooden walls, it becomes clear that insulation wasn't just a matter of materials. It was a lifestyle, a seasonal ritual of plugging, stuffing, layering, and most importantly, never sitting directly on a stone floor if you could help it. The coal was never far, but neither was ingenuity. Now, as we listen to the soft rustle of woolen blankets settling near a moss-chinked window, let's follow warmth's quiet journey even further. Not just in materials, but in the clever architectural designs that made winter not just survivable, but almost miraculously comfortable. While the modern world quivers at the thought of losing central heating for more than 5 minutes, our ancestors, the brave, the itchy, and the frostbitten, managed to outwit winter mostly without fiberglass thermostats or the dignified warmth of a heated toilet seat. But every so often, past innovation tiptoed forward, giving homes just a little more help by way of strange materials, winsome designs, or pure architectural stubbornness. And nowhere did this quiet evolution show itself more charmingly than in the curious case of the draft-stopping tapestry. Long before restoration hardware mass-produced vintage wall hangings for $1,100 a panel, medieval and Renaissance folk were already onto the thermal benefits of wall art. Large, elaborately woven tapestries designed not just to tell stories, but to stop wind from smacking your bedchamber silly. Your feudal lord might be tragic about losing his falcons, but you could count on him to have embroidered scenes of grief blocking a cold north wind from the castle's crumbling exterior. You see, stone walls, while wonderfully durable and excellent at staying exactly where they were for hundreds of years, were not so great at trapping heat. In fact, they were masters of distributing it outward. So how did nobles keep from freezing each winter? Well, in part, by hanging great swaths of insulation made of wool, linen, and sometimes even silk. Yes, silk, high-born insulation. You might shiver at the thought of heating a 14th century Scottish keep with only the seductive power of a forest-themed tapestry. But that was, in fact, part of the strategy. A woolen wall full of armored knights or slender nymphs didn't just say, "I'm cultured." It also whispered, "Please don't freeze me to death." And don't think this fanciful decor was restricted to castles. Manor houses, abbeys, and even modest homes used fabric, animal hides, and yes, many lovingly haphazard layers of old clothing, all nailed, pinned, or draped across drafty openings. The medieval world was sort of like your first attempt at living alone during grad school. Cheap curtains, questionable smells, and an enthusiasm for layering. Another clever method, and quite the marvel of passive insulation, was the box bed. Hugely common in colder regions of Europe, especially in France and the Netherlands. These contraptions looked like wardrobes, but behaved like beds, only sneakier. Slide open a wooden door and climb inside an enclosed wooden box, complete with straw mattress, sheepskin blanket, and almost no ventilation. It might have been a bit claustrophobic and occasionally reminiscent of a coffin, but it kept warm contained with impressive efficiency. In fact, the warmth accumulation in a box bed was so impressive that family members often took turns using it, or, more commonly, slept several to a box. Picture 3 generations of your family crammed into what looked like a bread drawer, each person blissfully baking in the shared body heat and questionable hygiene. Yet strangely, it worked. Meanwhile, over in Eastern Europe, peasant homes were mastering the art of building around the stove itself. The traditional Russian peasant hut, for one, often featured an enormous masonry stove, cleverly designed so that you didn't just cook on it, you lived on it. The top of the stove doubled as a sleeping platform, a cozy retreat for babushkas and grandbabies alike. Nothing says winter-proof like falling asleep on a brick oven. And while we're tucked into the clever nooks of centuries past, we should take a warm second to salute that most underappreciated hero of ancient insulation, the humble tapestry maker. These artisans wove not just art, but armor against the chill. Their creations were not merely decorative. They turned damp, rattling stone hovels into story-wrapped cocoons. So the next time you nudge your thermostat up 2 degrees and worry over the energy bill, remember the people of 5 centuries past who fended off cold with little more than tightly packed goose feathers, woolen imagery, wooden bed forts, and a steadfast refusal to accept that walls should be purely structural. Somewhere deep in an old Flemish estate or dusty Scottish tower, maybe a tapestry still flaps gently in a breeze that refuses to die. What stories it's held in, what heat it's kept in, and what secrets it still whispers to the mortar remain ever unclear. But for now, wrap yourself in your own blanket lair, dear sleeper. We're just beginning to see how architecture itself began to shift, corners squaring off against the cold. And soon, we're stepping inside a house designed with warmth finally in mind, on purpose. Somewhere in the dim, flickering candlelight of a Georgian-era drawing room, where the wallpaper politely pretended not to peel, and the floorboards creaked only when gossip was particularly juicy, there sat an object more prized than a full pantry or a clean wig, the humble parlour stove. By the 18th century, the world had grown tired of pretending that fire alone could be efficient, and thus, stoves began their refined march into family life. Tall, boxy, and typically made of solid cast iron, these early metal stoves looked like they could either warm your dinner or host a séance. Before central heating was born, or even flirted with the idea of existing, these stoves were the monarchs of the domestic winter. Unlike open hearths, which were a bit like warming your house by lighting a bonfire in the center and hoping for the best, stoves were closed systems. This allowed them to channel smoke upward, while keeping warmth distributed outward, like a metal friend who knew how to keep secrets and circulate hot gossip and air. Of course, you couldn't just light a stove and expect an even, toasty home. There were techniques, tricks, secrets passed down with the same hush-hush tones as family recipes. For example, where one place the stove mattered, strategically tucked into the heart of the house, preferably within view of multiple doorways, one stove could, in theory, heat several rooms, provided all doors remained open. No one stood in the way, and the wind didn't feel like messing with everyone's plans that day. Stoves ushered in a new era, sometimes called zoned heating, though in those days, zones referred less to thermostats and more to whether the cat could be convinced to move off your lap, because that was your only warm patch in the unheated wing. And yes, wings existed, even in very humble homes. Large farmhouses and manors had problematic square footage to heat, or put more historically, problematic cold space that humans stubbornly insisted on occupying. So families huddled. That's right. Despite all this innovation, snuggling remained undefeated. Beds were shared, blankets were layered like a croissant of survival, and doors to non-essential rooms were politely ignored from November to April. Meanwhile, some particularly forward-thinking souls got crafty with stove design. Benjamin Franklin, whose resume must have been written in 6-point font to fit everything on one side of a broadsheet, invented the Franklin stove in 1741. His creation used a clever system of baffles to maximize heat and reduce smoke. A rare moment in history where the chain of events didn't lead to singed eyebrows. The Franklin stove was a marvel compared to its blazing predecessors. Traditional fireplaces were notorious for losing a scandalous 80 to 90% of their heat straight up the chimney. This was the 18th century version of leaving your front door open during a snowstorm and wondering why your ankles were frosty. But of course, even Franklin's clever stove did not magically distribute heat throughout a home like an enchanted teapot, unless you employed the daring art of heat porting, which involved building flues, ducts, or little wooden tunnels through walls. most rooms still relied on personal ingenuity, which also meant more layers, long underwear, indoor shawls, pets strategically trained to lie atop feet, and wool, so much wool. If you were lucky, some of it was only moderately itchy. As the Industrial Revolution creaked into gear and iron became more affordable, stoves diversified. You could buy a parlor stove shaped like a miniature cathedral, complete with Gothic arches, or a stout squat model that resembled a beetle wearing a hat. Form met function, and suddenly, heating became just a little stylish. Sure, it still required hauling in coal or wood, minding the ash pan before it overflowed like a volcanic regret, and delicately opening vents with the grace of someone trying not to wake a dragon. But by candlelight, with snow tapping on frosted glass and the smell of oak smoke curling through the rafters, one could almost believe in magic. And indeed, warmth, like magic, was precious and preciously managed. A good stove meant comfort. A great stove meant status. But either way, it was a revolution in metal, fire and air, one that let winter nights be just a little more bearable, and quite a bit more snuggle-worthy. Now, let us drift a little farther into the quieter details of domestic survival. Beyond stoves and snuggles lies another nearly forgotten winter warrior, the bed warmer, and its reputation for mischief, oddly shaped coals, and the occasional flaming bedsheet. As nights lengthened and frost spiderwebbed across windows like nature's own lace, the medieval European peasant tucked into their bed, a word we'll use generously here. For what constituted a bed in the 14th century might more accurately be described as a pile of hope with a touch of straw. Let us tiptoe into the quiet embrace of those coal cottages, where insulation was less about materials and more about strategies. Materialists today might scoff. What, no fiberglass? No double-glazed argon-filled windows? But in a world without thermostats, humble ingenuity became the reigning warmth deity. One of the unheralded marvels of the Middle Ages was the bedsack, or as it was sometimes known, the family pylon. Whole households, often spanning 3 generations, cuddled together in corners of the main room, which, mercifully, also sheltered the animals. Sleeping beside your chickens wasn't just cute, it was strategic. Chickens are surprisingly warm, and they don't hog the blanket. Indeed, one study of historic peasant longhouses shows animals and humans cohabiting not out of affectionate barnyard whimsy, but for thermal efficiency. A cow, for instance, gives off a steady 1,000 watts of body heat. That's essentially a bovine space heater that produces milk and stares at you while you dream. But here's where the dreams begin to plume. Ever heard of the 4-poster bed canopy? The grand versions in manor houses weren't just peacock displays of status. The heavier the drapery, the better the insulation. Drawing the curtains at night meant creating a smaller microclimate inside the bed. An 1800s version of the climate-controlled sleep pod with slightly more moths. And for those less possessed of royalty and more possessed of cold toes, there was the humble bed warmer. Now this was a metal pan, resembling a suspiciously weapon-like frying pan, on a long handle, filled with hot coals and slid between the sheets before the sleeper got in. Of course, one had to be careful. A misstep with the bed warmer might mean skipping winter altogether and waking up in the next life. Beyond sleeping arrangements, clothing itself blurred lines between daywear and nightwear. The medieval tunic, slept in it, woolen hose, never took it off. Underwear, optional and seasonal at best. People essentially became walking bundles of their own insulation, human onions, layered and lightly smoky from proximity to the hearth. And for those lucky enough to lay claim to wood, the hearth provided the beating heart of warmth within the home. While the fireplace, as we know it, didn't become widespread until the late medieval period, earlier homes had central fire pits with a vent, or let's be honest, a hole in the roof. Not the most efficient system. You were warm below the waist, smoked above the neck, and lost somewhere in between. Still, people got creative with placement. In Nordic cultures, beds were built into walls, enclosed behind doors, almost like wooden lockers of snugness. The box bed, as it's called, remains one of the finest arguments for introversion ever mounted. Essentially, a personal cabin within your own home. But perhaps one of the strangest and coziest heating hacks came from Victorian England. The hot water bottle's woolen cousin, the brick. Heat a brick by the fire, wrap it in flannel, and pop it under the covers. It was affectionately known in some households as poor man's bed buddy. In a pinch, some folks used potatoes. Practical, and come morning, breakfast was halfway done. We must also give a slow, appreciative nod to tapestries. Not merely medieval art galleries, but also draft stoppers. The wealthier could afford wall hangings that weren't just aesthetic, but thermal. Nothing says cozy elegance quite like a woven unicorn keeping watch by your bed, while simultaneously blocking the wind's philosophical inquiries. Still, for most, the real insulation came not from what they added, but what they expected. Cold was a given, not an invader. People adjusted their bodies and minds. Frost on the inside of the windows, a natural part of waking up. Cold feet, just part of having feet. And so people adapted, not by resisting the cold, but by developing a weary kind of companionship with it. And even in today's world of heated floors and smart thermostats, part of us remains there, beneath woolen layers, pressed together near flickering embers, hoping our potato bed buddy doesn't roll onto the floor. Now, let's look toward the walls themselves, where secrets may have been stuffed, not with secrets, but with straw, cloth, and... Is that horsehair? Well, that's for next time. And so, we arrive at yet another quietly peculiar turn in the long, frosty saga of how humans didn't freeze to death, despite seemingly trying. You see, after enough generations of fingers nearly snapping off like waxy carrots thanks to bone-deep winter cold, people eventually developed a rather delightful solution, especially prominent in windy European villages and North American hamlets, the multi-generational huddle system, known today as just everyone living in the same house, probably uncomfortably close. Grandpa, grandma, 6 children, 3 cousins, an uncle with questionable nasal hygiene, and a goat that everyone pretended wasn't sleeping in the kitchen. They weren't just living together for economic reasons. No, they were central heating. The warmth of humanity, quite literally, was the insulation. In a time before radiant floor heating and triple glazed windows, the solution was simple: gather mass. The more bodies you packed into a singular space, the more collective warmth was generated. It's a basic principle of thermodynamics and family overpopulation. This wasn't just a cozy arrangement, it was thermal survival. To build on that, humble homes weren't just packed with people. They were designed to trap heat like overachieving teapots. Low ceilings? Check. Small doors? Indeed. Thick thatched or turf roofs? You bet. And not just for rustic charm. These materials had gaps, yes, but they also offered a kind of natural, albeit imperfect, insulation. They were like nature's disappointing attempt at memory foam. Now, consider the layout. The main room, often the only room, revolved around the hearth. This wasn't merely for cooking. The fire's gentle crackle wasn't just soundtrack, but an essential life force. Early homes were built around the notion that the hearth wasn't just the heart of the home, it was the immune system. Furniture would be dragged closer to the fire come winter, until beds kissed the coals and people developed that distinct, toasted on one side, frozen on the other, nighttime profile. Cottage contortionists, they curled up like cats, always facing the flames, as if worshipping the benevolent sun god that refused to rise between November and March. Clothing, too, did over time. People layered like onions with abandonment issues, wool upon wool again. And at bedtime, they didn't disrobe like modern dilettantes. They wore nightcaps, long johns, and sometimes yesterday's coat. And you'd do the same if your window was more of a suggestion than a structure. Even beds were communal. Privacy, unfortunately, was something only aristocrats and perhaps wolves could afford. Common folk shared beds not romantically, but thermodynamically. You might find yourself sleeping next to your brother, your sister, or a remarkably silent chicken. All that mattered was their core temperature. And then there were the bed warmers, glorious little pans of hot coals, slid under the covers before you climbed into them. Genius, somewhat risky, and potentially incendiary. It was a delicate dance with carbon monoxide, but the payoff was worth the gamble. No one likes icy sheets. Better a chance at mild suffocation than waking up in an ice coffin. Let us not forget the feather beds, down-stuffed masterpieces of pre-modern sleep luxury. In the absence of electric blankets, these thick mattress toppers provided a cloud-like barrier between you and the punishing world outside. And though feathers occasionally poked through to stab you with avian vengeance, they were valued like gold. In the far north, ingenious bed boxes became the hallmark of Scandinavian design, long before IKEA ever invented the hex key. These were miniature wooden enclosures with sliding doors, half coffin, half cuddlier hobbit home, designed to contain body heat and discourage wandering drafts. You didn't merely go to bed. You vanished into a personal sauna of breath, moisture, and dreams. And what of the windows? Ah yes, they were seldom transparent. Real glass was a costly treasure, so wealthier homes might have tiny panes. Poorer ones had wax parchment, oiled cloth, or just a resolute sense of denial. Anything to keep the wind from treating your living room like a crime scene. It was in these enclosed, smoke-tinged, body-warmed microclimates that humans survived. Not comfortably, not stylishly, but with resilience, a touch of mutual body odor tolerance, and probably dreams of something called central heating that hadn't been invented yet. And so, under flickering candlelight, beneath 5 layers of cats, second cousins, and repurposed shawls, our ancestors curled into each other like spooning spoons, half asleep, half frozen, fully determined not to die before spring. But before we drift entirely under this feathery quilt of historical comfort, we might turn our gaze through our waxed parchment window toward another quirk of winter survival. Because next, we'll gently unearth the marvelous and rather smoky secrets of medieval chimneys, and why their earliest versions sometimes roasted more people than potatoes. A quiet revolution, as soft as the hush of snowfall on a thatched roof, slipped into northern Europe during the 19th century. It was not loud like the chimneys of industrial Britain, nor as grand as Napoleon's egotistical redesigns of Paris. Instead, it was small, practical, and utterly transformative. It was the storm window. Yes, dear dreamer, the humble storm window. a secondary pane of glass layered over the original, like a Victorian cardigan for your house. You see, while grand palaces had servants to stoke endless fires, and poor villagers had their survival instincts honed by generations of frostbite, the growing middle class in colder climates simply wanted to not expel a shivering sigh every time the wind whistled through the floorboards. The answer was layering. Just as a person might pile on a waistcoat, a woolen vest, and a knitted scarf, houses could wear a second skin of glass. Storm windows became especially popular in the United States during the mid-1800s, largely because Americans had an even chillier relationship with drafts. Due to the relative cheapness and availability of glass, thanks in part to industrial glass-blowing advances and the charmingly named four-core process, windows could be ordered and installed far more easily than ever before. The resulting double glazing effect trapped a snug pocket of air, thermal insulation, without the drama. Now, let us drift into one such house as evening folds the prairie into a violet hush. The year is 1883, and the town of Newton, Iowa, exhales into winter like a tired steamboat. Inside the Marshall family's two-story home, neither lavish nor poor, just comfortably creaky, Father Marshall has successfully nailed storm panels into place. They groaned initially against the aging frames, but now they sit firm, ready to fend off December's breath. Mother Marshall is less convinced. Her faith lies in the merits of hot bricks wrapped in cloth and tucked into bed like sleepy puppies. She also holds stock in window quilts. Yes, these are real things. Window quilts were literal patchwork blankets hung across windows at night, the ancestor of today's blackout curtains, though with more character and occasional moth holes. On especially earnest nights, she would double layer them, turning their parlor into something of a maternal fortress. The children, oh, they didn't concern themselves with technicalities. They would skate across frozen puddles outside, then come barreling into the home like woolen cannonballs, trailing snow and emitting shrieks of joy. Once inside, they would warm their hands beside ceramic stoves filled with smouldering coal. The coal, you'll note, delivered by a slightly surly man with a soot-stained cap and 5 stories about how things were colder back in the 70s. And he meant the 1870s, of course. These coal stoves weren't terribly efficient, but paired with layered rugs, tight drapery, and the firm belief that being coal built character, people got by, and that you might say was the secret ingredient. Collective tolerance. Even storm windows, as clever and helpful as they were, couldn't stop the floorboards from being Arctic territory. But spirits were high, and toes were bundled. Across the Atlantic, similar scenes unfolded. In Scandinavia, families in wooden cottages tucked themselves near tiled stoves called kakelun, an invention so efficient it could warm a room for hours with just a few logs. In fact, Swedish government officials in the 1700s had sponsored improvements to these stoves to cope with deforestation and heat loss, knowing full well that proper insulation was still a few centuries off. Their solution: make the stove smarter, not the walls thicker. Meanwhile, wealthier families in cities began to flirt with the concept of built-in insulation. Corkboards, horsehair plaster, and, rather disastrously at times, asbestos began appearing in walls, marketed with great fanfare and minimal health disclaimers. Asbestos, the miracle material that could resist fire, heat, and the passage of time, until it couldn't. But back in our cozier corner of Iowa, none of that mattered. The Marshalls had their storm windows, their quilts, and their bricks, and they had each other's body heat, which, after all, is the most stubbornly relentless source of warmth. so as snow continued to draw white lines across the window panes like a sleepy spider dragging silk, the house settled into itself. Warm coals drifted in the iron belly of the stove. The children sank deeper into patchwork quilts, and Wine's howl became just another bedtime verse. But what about the grand country houses, those cavernous British manors and French villas, with ceilings that scoffed at heat? Surely they didn't hang quilts from their windows or tuck in hot bricks. Ah yes, that story deserves its own candlelit chapter. As the wind rattled the shutters of homes long since recycled into romantic ruins, one cannot help but marvel at the steadfast determination of humankind to make winters not only survivable, but vaguely fashionable. Yes, upon the frozen tapestry of history, the humble curtain, bless its billowing soul, rises to a place of dramatic importance. Let us stroll now into the art of indoor drapery. Heavy cloth not just as decorative flourish, but as noble line of defense. Before the arrival of central heating, that distant cousin of pure sorcery, many households deployed thick wool or velvet curtains across every breach in their domestic castle. These weren't just hung at windows. No. Doorways, archways, even inexplicably drafty wall cracks received their very own swaddling of cloth. The Victorians in particular were quite the connoisseurs of this curtain-centric approach. In the drawing rooms of London, one could be forgiven for believing a significant portion of the British Empire had been slain to produce such volumes of fabric. Winter drapery came down like nightfall at tea time. Layers upon layers heavy enough to smother an argument, if not an entire person. Now, picture an 18th century Scottish parlour. Outside, the Highlands moan with wind that sounds vaguely judgmental. Inside, the flicker of firelight dances across the walls. Walls that, incidentally, have an R value somewhere just above a damp piece of toast. But thanks to wall-hugging tapestries, carpets nailed to the inside of doors, and a well-placed curtain or three, that parlour is merely frostbitten rather than fully glacial. It's all relative. And let's not overlook the pièce de résistance of cosy historical living, the bed curtain. Four-poster beds did more than lend gravitas to your nightly flop. They formed a kind of cloth microclimate. With curtains drawn tight, a bed became a heat-conserving cocoon, equal parts elegant and desperate. Families might share these warm fabric pods, especially in Scandinavia or rural France, where winter evening entertainment was limited to comparing frostbite and listening for wolves. Or, in a fine twist that combines architectural elegance with the undeniable practicality of hoarding body heat, we reach the box bed. Particularly beloved in 16th and 17th century rural settings, the box bed was essentially a cupboard you slept in. Complete with doors that closed shut behind you, it allowed the sleeper to seal themselves into a pocket of exhaled warmth. A claustrophobe's nightmare, perhaps, but blissfully snug in February. For the truly elite, those with not only candles to burn, but the income to replace them, beds might be warmed before slumber by way of a bed warmer. A metal pan filled with glowing coals swirled between blankets before entry. This cherished routine, medieval, toddler, dangerous though it may sound, was as common as brushing one's teeth is today, except of course with a slightly higher risk of setting everything you love on fire. In colonial New England, where a cheerful Puritan design philosophy dictated that joy must be fought for, hearty families would heat the room by stuffing everyone into exactly one of them. The kitchen became the winter stronghold, hearth blazing, soup bubbling, and unspoken agreements about communal foot warming. If you had to step into an unheated bedchamber, the goal was simple. Get in, lie still, pretend the frost on the pillow isn't whispering your name. Even social gatherings moved centrally. Parlours were shuttered tight and swaddled in fabric. Curtains were drawn, draft excluders jammed under doors, and Aunt Mildred was encouraged to position herself between the window and the inflow of Arctic despair. Better still, the family might move upstairs in winter altogether, abandoning the grand main floors in a practical shuffle towards smaller rooms with lower ceilings, easier to heat, cozier to sleep in, and more likely to contain a grandfather with good bedtime stories shouted through toothless charm. And tucked beneath all of this, all the curtains and cushions and coals, was perhaps the oldest form of insulation: togetherness. Whether it was families pressed tight in peat-insulated crofts, lovers nestled in curtained beds, or neighbours bringing over hot stew with honeyed motives, winter survival was a communal effort. Warmth, it turns out, was a group project. So here we are, wrapped in the plush folds of history's finest Damascus wool, watching the last embers of a fire once stoked in 1692 start to fade. But before sleep claims us fully, there's just one more thread to pull in this great quilt of bygone winters. The curious case of intentional indoor cold, and why, for some bizarre reason, certain rich folks wanted it that way. Every so often, when the snow fell quietly and the wind flattened itself along the rooftops like a sleepy cat, old winter homes would seem to exhale. Steam curling from chimney tops, the faint scent of burning wood, oak or pine, depending on how well off the family was, wafted into the chill dusk. And inside those venerable houses of timber and stone, where insulation was, at best, a matter of creative guesswork, people burrowed in, not unlike highly social squirrels in long underwear. You'd think that after so many centuries of exposure to snow-draped suffering, pre-modern humans might have invented styrofoam or fiberglass a few millennia earlier. But no, as it turns out, survival was a blend of architecture, community, body heat, and an astonishing tolerance for discomfort. One of the less appreciated marvels of historical ingenuity was the way homes were designed not to exclude the cold entirely, but to manage, trap, and tame it. Like training a lion to sleep like a lapdog. Low ceilings kept warm air from staging its usual rebellion and fleeing upward. Thick thatched roofs, packed with straw and daubed with muddy insulation more suitable for pigs than people, kept out wind and presented a lovely snack if a goat got loose indoors. In Highland cottages in Scotland and Ireland, they even invited animals inside, not for company, but for warmth. The cow doubled as a space heater. Chickens might live under the bed, and pigs were sometimes housed just a plank wall away. The smell was likely active, shall we say, but it reduced the chill significantly. One might not enjoy one's breakfast porridge in the aroma of fresh manure, but at least the porridge itself was warm. In larger European farmhouses, box beds became their own microclimates. These were essentially wooden closets with a mattress inside, a bed with doors, a little wooden crypt for dreaming, a cozy tomb of wool and breath, where couples, grannies, even a whole family of chill-resistant children might doze in the same compartment. It sounds bizarre now, but they were beloved. People climbed into them, planted kisses on each other's frozen noses, then pulled the curtains shut like they were boarding a train to Sleepy Town. Further east, in the chill of Central Asian steppes, Kazakh yurts and Mongolian jers used felt, compressed sheep's wool, to line their circular walls. One might laugh at the concept of portable warmth assembled without modern tools, but felt is surprisingly insulative, especially when you stack enough animal hair to lose a small child in. Add a central stove with a flue rising through the ceiling hole. Sprinkle in some vodka and robust storytelling, and you had a winter living room that could withstand the bashings of a Siberian tantrum. To compensate for drafty walls and wildly ambitious windows, people didn't just insulate their homes, they insulated themselves. Layers were key: undergarments, overgarments, over-overgarments. It might take 20 minutes to unpeel before bed. Wool cloaks, fur hoods, sometimes even straw-stuffed jackets in leaner regions, where textile luxuries hadn't quite made the guest list. And then there was sleep itself, a communal event. Shared blankets, sometimes made of patchwork nothingness, known as bed feathers. These weren't always made of actual feathers, more often merely optimism sewn into cloth. But when people slept together under one of these optimism-laced covers, side by side, the collective warmth was astonishing. A family of 4 could generate the toasty equivalent of a small fireplace, provided no one stole the covers or had unusually chilly feet. Perhaps the most miraculous thing is that despite the cold, the drafts, the lack of double glazing, and the curious invasions of livestock, people still found winter to be a time for gathering, singing, storytelling, and yes, sleeping. Hibernation wasn't just for bears. It was a semi-legitimate pastime in northern households. When daylight disappeared by 4 o'clock and candle wax had to be rationed, slowness was not just practical, it was poetic. So next time your central heating kicks in and you complain that your socks are only slightly warm, think of the 18th century farmer curled up behind a stove, wrapped in 14 layers of underpants, with a chicken warming its claws on his back and a pig snoring through the wall. He would have traded you 1 goat and half a turnip for your thermostat and a pair of fleece-lined slippers. And now, dear listener, feel the weight of history settling over your shoulders like a thick woolen shawl. The ancestors have tucked you in with their laughter and resilience. The fire is dying down to embers. The wind stumbles softly against the shutters, and the sheep are all accounted for. Outdoors this time. Close your eyes. Drift gently. The cold can't reach you here. You're wrapped in centuries of survival and stillness. And that is enough for tonight.